noon on Wednesday, February the 8th, Eastern. It's 12 o'clock Eastern. We are very happy to have you all here today. We are doing a live stream today in which we answer some of the most frequently asked questions on this year's calendar blanket. And I also have a list of questions from the family members regarding the blanket, graph work, stuff like that. So that's what we're going to do today. We're going to just sort of answer some questions. Hopefully, if you've had any kind of concerns or you've been wondering about something to do with this year's project, hopefully the question will be answered today. We are still in the setup stage. So Mr. InStitches is not in the room with me. It is just me and you. Mr. InStitches is, well, say something, sweetie.
Hello. Hello. Hello.
So if he sounds like he's down a hall in a well, that's exactly where he is. It's going to be kind of like the last time we did it. He's not in the room, so he won't be able to sort of chime in that much, but he is very much here. He's in the chat. He's going to be reading through everything that you guys sort of have to say in the chat. So I hope the chat is nice and busy. He'll be running polls. He'll be kind of just managing things like he normally does, but you won't hear him as much because he's not in the room. But that's okay because I have a ton of stuff to get through today. And I have my little page right here, a bunch of questions, a couple of other little things. So we've got some sort of general questions, we've got some general history, and we've got some pointed questions from family members. And so we're going to get into it. Got a nice little cup of coffee, and yeah, hopefully you can all hear me and see me all right. Like we said, we're still kind of getting the whole setup thing. We're working on it. It's not exactly the way we want it yet, but we're getting there. Okay, one last sip of my coffee. I'm going to grab my glasses, and we are going to get into it. So, as you all know, we are doing the Fair Isle style calendar blanket project this year, and that involves graph work. So we're using a 2-to-1 ratio row, I should say stitch to row graph, and I'll explain a little bit more about that later when I'm talking about different kinds of graphs, because that's the question that did come up quite a bit. But briefly, if any of you are completely new to the Fair Isle concept, Fair Isle is a style of knitting. So the knitters out there will probably have heard of this. And a lot of you might, if you looked up Fair Isle knitting or Fair Isle knitwear, you will also see a lot of Scandinavian or Norwegian style knitwear. That all kind of ends up in the same pot. They're very similar. Fair Isle is literally the name of the island. It's one of the Shetland Islands off the coast of Scotland. And a particular kind of knit design evolved there. But it's also kind of a fishing port. And it's, people have been living there for thousands of years. And they've done a lot of trade with the close Norwegian islands. So obviously there's going to be sharing of all kinds of ideas over the millennia, ideas for how to cook and, for crochet or knitwear and crafting and you name it, people sort of share ideas. So that's why there's a lot of similarity between the Norwegian, Scandinavian kind of look of that classic Scandinavian knit style where it's like two colors and it's a bunch of sort of kind of pixelated looking images, and the same with the Fair Isle style. The Fair Isle knitwear is kind of recognized by two main things. There's usually no more than two colors carried at the same time. Even if the colors change, you're usually only working between two colors at once, like in a certain band, kind of like what we're doing this year with the blanket. And it's typically mirror image, simple shapes. So, and that kind of plays into sort of how the graph is readable this year. It's the shapes are almost always mirror image of each other. Like they're not usually like this side is different from that side. It's usually like if you're going up, you're coming down, and if you're going down, you're coming up, and it's like they kind of mirror image shapes. I'm not quite sure how to put that, but the shapes are mirror image. So it doesn't really matter if you're reading the graph from one side or the other, because it's kind of the same whether you're coming or going. So those are the two kind of hallmarks of Fair Isle style knitting. And of course, we're doing a crochet concept based on that. So this is very much inspired by Fair Isle knitting, but it cannot be considered Fair Isle knitting, A, because it's crochet, and B, because we're using different stitches. We're definitely doing mirror image shapes. And we're definitely carrying a couple colors, which is why it's very much in the Fair Isle style, but it's going to look different than knitting because knitting is different than crochet. And we're using the 2-to-1 ratio stitch to row graph because we are using a double crochet this year. But like I said, more on that later. Okay, so that's kind of just briefly how things tie in with the Fair Isle style and why you might see things labeled Norwegian versus Fair Isle. The two are very similar. There's just very sort of minor differences between them, but they're definitely related. And I'm gonna have a sip of my coffee. Everything all right out down there, Mr. InStitches?
I'm surviving. I'm surviving down the well.
I'll be sure to pour some coffee down there for you.
Yes, please. I could use some hot coffee.
Okay, so we asked the family members a couple of, I guess last week, a few days ago, what their most frequently asked questions were pertaining to this year's project, to craft work, changing color, stuff like that. And over the last, I guess, few days, we've been compiling questions. I've also been going through the entire comment section on all of the videos we've put up about the Fair Isle style counter blanket so far. So I have some other generalized questions. And we've also put out some quick tip videos. So we know not everybody watches from their subscription listing. So there might be a lot of videos that you've missed. Or you just might not have gotten the notification if your notifications A, aren't turned on, or B, are turned on, but there's other software stuff that's interfering with it. Happens to everybody, happens constantly. So if you're not getting notifications, it's probably nothing that you've done. But if you check on your subscription button, so if you're on the YouTube app and you're signed in, if instead of being on the home page where you see sort of just whatever YouTube thinks you might be interested in seeing, if you click on your subscriptions, you'll see everything you're subscribed to in chronological order. So every channel you're subscribed to, as videos come out, they come out in the chronological order that they came out. And that's where you'll see everything that everybody's done and you won't miss anything. So in further to that, we've done 2, 3, maybe 4. Let me think. We did an introduction to graph work video before we launched the blanket concept officially. So there's a little how to read a graph and how to sort of do basic color changing video. We put that one out first. We put one out on how to make your own spools, which is quite handy if you need little bits of color to do sort of the color change work that we're doing in this year's blanket. I'm going to talk more about spools and loading them and all that because there's some good questions about that too. So we have a little video on how to make your own spools. We've got a video on how to weave in tails. So there's a lot of tails when you're doing color work, and there's several ways that you can sort of tie them in and then weave them in afterwards. And we thought a little sort of pointed video on how I'm weaving in my tails. And then just a couple other sort of pointers about how you might want to treat your tails depending on the yarn you're using or the stitch tension. We have a little video on that. And we also just put one out yesterday, I think, or the day before. I'm losing track of my days on how to tie in more color to your spool if your spool runs out of color before you're finished with it. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that too. But we do have some sort of quick tip videos for you in regards to all of those things, because those were definitely questions that came up pretty frequently. And we thought maybe like a visual might be helpful. So keep the questions coming. If we don't get to them all today, or you didn't hear the question that you thought, maybe you had, please leave it in the comment section below, and we'll be able to answer it directly. And or if we see it come up enough and it's something that we kind of overlooked, then maybe we'll do a little quick tip video on it, because they seem to be really helpful. A lot of people we're getting lots of positive feedback from the little short videos on kind of answering specific questions. And we don't mind doing that because now we have better internet and it's easier for us to get something out to you in a timely fashion. Okay, so first question. This is a question from Key West, and she wanted to know, how does Fair Isle style or graph work crochet differ from regular crochet and Tunisian crochet? Would we consider it easier or harder? And I like this question because it's very subjective. So Some people will probably find Tunisian crochet relatively easy, and some people will find it really tricky. And if you've got a knitting background, Tunisian crochet won't seem quite so crazy to you, or quite so awkward necessarily, because you'll already have some knitting background where you're used to having all of your loops on one long needle. In which case you might find Tunisian crochet, you know, relatively accessible and not terribly difficult or very easy. Other people might find it tricky because keeping all those loops on for one pass and then getting them all off without confusing them and, you know, dropping them or adding extra, that could be, you know, problematic, especially if you've never knit before. If you're starting knitting, that's something you run into. You drop loops, you add them by accident, you know. So I wouldn't really want to compare it to Tunisian crochet in a sense of it being easy or hard, because Tunisian crochet is a kind of a different method than regular crochet, and this uses regular crochet. Now, having said that, I'm hoping most of you saw the post we did last, I think it was on this weekend, or last, I guess it would have been last week. I'm having such trouble keeping track of dates. Or I think it was late last week. Monica has been doing a version of the blanket using the regular crochet, double crochet graph that we're doing. And she's also been making a version using the Tunisian double crochet stitch. And she sent us a couple photographs, which we were really excited to share with everybody to sort of see the difference between regular double crochet and Tunisian crochet. And if you missed it, you can always go to our channel homepage by clicking on our name, Jayda InStitches. It'll take you right to the channel homepage, and then you can click on community, and you can just scroll back through the post. It's not back too far, and you can sort of see the difference between the two. I think it's really neat, and I think she's committed to making an entire blanket, one in Tunisian double crochet and one in regular double crochet, because you can use because it's a mirror image graph, you're always reading the graph from the same side as you go across, but it doesn't matter because it's the same whether you're going this way or that way, whatever row you're on. So row one always starts and finishes the same way. Doesn't matter what direction you're going. So that's why we say, you know, righties start here, lefties start here, but technically it doesn't really matter. So if you get confused, it doesn't matter what side of the graph you're starting on because we're using mirror image shapes. So if you're left-handed, it's fine. If you're right-handed, it's fine. And it doesn't technically matter what way you're looking at, because it's always going to be the same number of stitches up to a color change, same number of stitches, and so on, no matter what direction you're coming on a given row. So would I say it's easier or harder? If you're only dealing with one strand of yarn when you're crocheting, that is easier than dealing with more than one strand of yarn, just because the more you add to your plate, the more you have to balance. So if you're changing between colors, you have to pay attention. You have to kind of think, oh, okay, this is the stitch before I change colors. So I'm going to only work half of it, and then I'm going to finish it with the other color so that that finishing loop sits, that change of color sits over top of the next colored stitch. And it's the same and it matches all the way along. You have to keep that in mind. Otherwise, you know, if you're just double crocheting, so you can sort of turn your brain off sometimes and just watch a TV show or something. But when you're changing colors or you're following a graph, you kind of have to pay attention. So in that regard, it's not as easy as just plain old regular double crochet. But it's not maybe as you're still only dealing with one stitch at a time. So in that regard, I would say it's easier than Tunisian, because in Tunisian crochet, if you were going to follow the graph, not only are you paying attention to when the color change happens, but you're also dealing with all your loops and stitches on the hook for the forward pass and then taking them all off for the reverse pass. And you want to keep in mind your color changing as you're on your way back. Now, I think Monica made some notes about, I'm going to have to refresh what I read about them, but I think she said she was not necessarily changing colors on the way back on the reverse pass. I think she said she was just using one color, but I could be wrong. So I have to kind of, sorry, Monica, if you're watching, I can't remember quite what you did. If you are, can you just mention it in the chat or the comment section down below? That would be great, because what? No, I'm talking to Monica if she's watching.
Oh, sorry. I'll go back into my hole.
Crawl back into your hole, mister. Anyway, yeah, so I would say it's easier than Tunisian crochet in general, just because you're only dealing with one stitch at a time. But it's not as easy as regular double crochet or regular crochet, because you are dealing with color changing. So it's somewhere in the middle. I am comfortable with this style of crochet. And I still frog stitches, entire rows sometime. When I've been working on the blanket, I've gotten almost all the way to the end, and all of my graph imagery has lined up, but somehow I still had an extra stitch. That happened when I was doing the January snowflakes, and I think it was about row 8. I took it out three times, and I could not, for the life of me, figure out how I'd gotten an extra stitch. And then, until I did like practically an autopsy on it, like I took it out one stitch at a time, and I was really, really paying attention, and I realized that if you are changing colors, so when you get to a color change and you start the first half of a double crochet, and then you drop the color you were using for the first half of the double crochet, so let's say color A, and then you finish the double crochet stitch with color B so that you can change the top of it. If you accidentally do the whole stitch, yarn over, pick up a loop, yarn over, pull back through 2, yarn over, pull back through 2, you complete a full double crochet with color A because you're not paying close attention, and then you change to color B and chain, you've just added a stitch. And then you go ahead and you start working. Well, the color of the stitch, the chain part, will be correct sitting over top of your next color change. But you accidentally added a chain in between a completed stitch and the next completed stitch. And it's very difficult to see unless you're taking it out one thing at a time. So if this happens to you, you get across, or you're counting and you cannot for the life of you figure out where you picked up an extra stitch, go back and take a look and make sure you didn't accidentally add a chain with the new color in between the color change. So it's in between your color changes where you might accidentally add in a stitch that in the next row you will see and use, right? So that's something that I've discovered that I've been doing that I thought I'd better bring up in case it happens to any of you. Okay. Kimberly asks, how do you figure out how much is 12 yards or the required amount for the individual spools? So we just did a quick tip video on that. That's another one of the quick tip videos. I guess we've done 5. Is figuring out a quick way to measure yarn. So if I say to you, okay, you're going to want to load each spool with 11 yards, 12 if you really have loose tension, and you don't have a measuring tape, or you don't want to sort of sit there and fiddle with a measuring tape and running yarn along it, we did a little video on this really old tip that I've been using for sewing. The women in my family are all big sewers, and one of the things they taught me how to do very early on was how to quickly guesstimate a yard of fabric. So you'd sort of hold the end and then to about your nose, and then you'd stretch out your arm, and that's about a yard. Now, I'm Canadian. We don't use the imperial system here, but because all the older folks in my family did grow up with the imperial system, I was raised and taught how to sew using the imperial system. So I understand inches and yards. Very little else about the imperial system, but I know inches and yards. So that's why I'm comfortable sort of talking about how many yards you might need in yarn, because I'm used to this very organic, natural sort of shape or length of my arm, which is about a yard. Now, when we put up that video, there was a whole bunch of really great comments. Some people were sort of complaining that their arms are short. If you're a child, obviously, when I learned to sew, I was a child. So this was not yet a yard for me, but it was close enough. And I started adjusting. So I took a measuring tape and I decided to see how far I had to change the angle of my nose before I actually got a full yard or very close to it. And a couple people mentioned that they do that. They realize that, oh, well, I have to turn my head like a 45-degree angle or a 90-degree angle, and then I'll get an actual yard. Other people kind of have measured like a finger. They might, one of you said you had a middle finger that was exactly 3 inches. And so you'd be using that when you were measuring out fabric, which made me giggle because I was picturing you giving the middle finger to everybody in the fabric store. Like, just because you were measuring and everybody being really offended and you're wondering why every time I come here, everybody's in such a bad mood. Anyway, that's handy. So if you know how long your hand is, or if you want to measure like, from your elbow to your wrist or your end of your finger, actually do the measurement on yourself one day with a measuring tape and just think to yourself, okay, well, from, my wrist to the inside of my elbow is 1 foot perfectly. All right, I'll just use that as my measuring tool. It's basically like you have a measuring stick that you can bring around with you. And quickly, if you're measuring out yarn, because you don't have to hold it against a measuring tape, this is just a nice quick way to measure out however many yards or feet or inches of yarn you might need to wrap around a spool. That said, one of the things that can happen is that you underestimate how much yarn you need on the spool. So it's always better to overestimate. Typically when I finish, I have a little bit of yarn left on all of my spools, which isn't a big deal. I just unwind it and I kind of tie all of those ends together, and I'm going to use them in some extreme scrap project at some point. But if you don't put on enough, which I did for one of the spools in the most recent graph work, for some reason, I was short about, I don't know, half a yard. We did a little video on how to quickly tie in a little bit more. So you're just sort of guesstimating. If you know you only have a few stitches left, then you know you have less than a yard required. And then you just sort of tie in a little bit. So you just take a length and then tie it in. I just knot mine in. I know there are fancy, pretty ways to tie in more yarn. There's a method called, there's a whole bunch of different tailor methods that have come up with different names now, again, because the internet has people pouring in from all over the place and they've all got different names for the same thing. But I've seen, you know, where people kind of like split one yarn and split the other yarn and twist them back together. That works really well with wool, because wool has little teeth and it'll stop it from pulling apart. But I don't find that process works well with acrylic or sort of slippery yarns, or very thin yarns that don't have a lot of ply. And I've also seen one called, I think it's called the tailor's knot, or at least that's one title for it, the weaver's knot, where you tie it around, you tie the end of one yarn tail around the length of the next yarn, and then you tie that yarn tail around the other side, like around the length of the other side. So you've kind of got a knot here and a knot here, and then you pull the two ends and the knots slide up together. And then, you know, I've seen people kind of trim them. Again, I would only trim off the tails completely if those knots were really tight and they were wool. Otherwise, I would leave the tails a little longer and then crochet over top of them. But that's a nice way to kind of hide a couple knots too. So there's a lot of ways to do it. I like to go with the fastest way that I know will not unwind. So the knot that we demonstrate in that little quick tip video does not come undone, because all of the weight of it is pulling at the knot. Now, if you're using really slippery yarn, it might possibly want to slide on you, but it shouldn't, just because if you're knotting the two strands together and treating them as one, the pressure of pulling that knot apart doesn't really make it want to move. That's why I prefer it. And with acrylic, I've never had one come undone in the entire time I've made, crocheted, knit, washed blankets. So that's the route that I went for this year. If I have to add in a little bit of color, because it's fast, it's easy, it's not a complicated knot, and it disappears because you're doing a double crochet stitch. So that's a little tip we did, because we realized that other people were running into that problem too. Drinking coffee, in case anybody's wondering. Okay, so that was the how do you figure out how much is 12 yards? So that's a handy little tool, and it's just basically guesstimation. So if you think maybe you might be a bit short, you know, add one more count to that. If I say 11, maybe do 12. If you think your arms are really, really long, then 11 should be just fine. But you can always just measure it once to kind of see, you know, how close you are to a yard. And it's a really handy, it's handy for a lot of things, not just like, you know, figuring out a short amount of yarn for a spool load. It's also helpful if you're, you know, into sewing, or if you're, you know, kind of just measuring any sort of little thing, you're out and about, and you just sort of measure out a bit of rope or something. It's a handy little tip. Excuse me. All right, Dawn asked, how do we keep smooth tension between color changes? That's a great question. I struggled a little bit with that myself when I was first sort of getting comfortable with color changes. I find that it's mostly just about slowing down. So when you get to a color change and you start the first stitch and then you finish it with the new color, before you move on, I like to gently tighten up on the color I've just dropped. So let's say color A, and then kind of gently tug on color B, or if I've already used color B and I'm switching back to it, I tug on it gently before I finish that last stitch before the color change with color B, just so if there's any loose sort of yarn from carrying color B, it won't eventually make the stitch loose. So you want to just tug it gently so that A, it hides, and B, it's not got any looseness to affect the stitch tension. And then when you do the next couple of stitches, maybe just pause and I like to just sort of pull out my work a little bit. I want to make sure I'm not pulling too tightly, excuse me, on the yarn I'm carrying, because I don't want to pinch my stitches together. And I also want to make sure that I'm not, sometimes if you pull a little too tightly on the color change, it'll like almost shrink the stitch next to the color change or shrink the first color changed stitch. And that is all just comes with getting used to your own tension. And you know what, I tend to be a little loose when I change colors, so I'll pause before I get too much further into the new stitches, tighten up on A, tighten up on B. Okay, that looks good, and then continue. I'm very tight with the color changes. Okay, well, before I do the color change, I'm going to just finish that stitch, give myself a little bit of rope, so to speak, pull out A and pull out B and give it just a little bit more breathing space, and then continue with my crochet. And also you can, when you're weaving in your tails afterwards, you can take your tails and just sort of, if it's too tight, you can pull up on the stitch and give it a little bit more breathing room, or give it a little bit more ease. And if it's loose, you can kind of tighten up the stitch by, yanking on your tails. This is all small, nuanced practice stuff that is very unique to the crocheter, because all of our tensions differ. But the more you get comfortable changing colors and then, just tugging gently on the color you've just carried and then tugging gently on the color you just changed from, the more you get kind of used to that, the less you'll see you have tension issues between color changes. It's just like any other new technique. You kind of have to get your muscles comfortable with the change, and it'll even itself out, just like everything else does. So that's kind of the sort of the technical thing, is just to kind of be aware of the tension on the different strings. Maybe pause. You don't just keep on going and then go, oh, that was really loose. Just look at your stitches in and around the color change as you're doing it, and that gives you more control at the time to make sure that they're either not too tight or not too loose. But it'll get easier with practice. All right, Carolyn asked, do you really need to use spools? What about carrying the color throughout? So Carolyn said she just had a secondary ball of yarn and just carried the B color throughout, using it when necessary and then continuing to carry it. So instead of having 6 individual spools, she just carried the color throughout the blanket. Absolutely, you can do that. One of two things will happen. You're going to use up more yarn. If it's not a big deal, it's not a big deal. But it will use up more yarn because you're constantly working over top of yarn you're not using. So that does tend to, you will use more over the course of the entire blanket. Like I said, if it's not a big deal, then don't worry about it, but it will use more yarn. 2, you have more opportunity to possibly see that carried color through the other stitches. So one of the things that kind of is unique about the graph work that we're doing this year is that you will see a little bit of color kind of poking through the other stitches, which, because it tends to look uniform with the other images in the blanket, it becomes part of the overall textured textile appearance. I like it. It reminds me of weaving, where you can see the warp threads through the weft threads, or vice versa. And some people don't like it. And some people kind of want to control it a little more, which is why I say, pull on that carried color, because it'll help make it hide behind the stitches that it's underneath. And it'll also kind of pinch together some of those stitches, which will also help to hide that carried color. And, the differences between, like, some lights aren't as light and some darks aren't as dark. And so they kind of blend and you won't see it as much. But if you are carrying a color the entire way, you will have more opportunity for it to show through. Having said that, that can also create more uniformity in that area of the color changing. So you can absolutely just carry one ball of color throughout if you find that easier, as opposed to, juggling 6 spools. Or you can chop it up like I do to kind of just give yourself a limited amount, have less carrying to worry about, and also use less yarn. So you can do both. Rianne asked, how to carry or float more than one color at a time. So we are going to be dealing with just two colors mainly throughout. Obviously, I showed you in the February one. I've got my little bucket here. So in the February, we had three different options. Actually, I'll just show you all of them. We had three different options for the February graph because we like to do that. One of the options was to do the inside of the heart a third color. So you could be, in theory, balancing 12 spools, so 2 colors for each heart, in addition to your color A. You'd have a color B and a color C, in which case you would be carrying 2 colors for a couple of places. You would treat carrying more than one color just like it was only one. So if you've got to work over 2, you're working over 2. It will make the base of the stitch that you've crocheted a little thicker because now it's working over top of not just the stitch that you're building it onto, but you're working over top of 2 additional strands of yarn. So it'll be minute depending on the weight of your yarn, but it will look a little chubbier than some of the other stitches in the row that aren't worked over 1 or 2 carried yarns or carried colors. You do run the risk of seeing 2 colors carried through that area, but at the same time, because it's thicker and there's a lot more going on, you might also not see any carrying at all because you are thickening up the stitches because they have to work now over top of 2 carried yarns. So this is why I always say, make yourself a little sampler, because the yarn you're using might be a little thinner. It might be really obvious that you see carried colors. Your yarn might, or you might have a particular tension that you don't see any carrying at all. You might like the idea of a lighter center and a darker outline to kind of give it like a dark border or whatever. Samples are important, especially with this year's blanket, because you know, like it can really change the look. Like this is the same graph. That's solid. That's 2 colors. And then this is the one that we actually did, which is just like a hollow center. It's an open heart. I think that makes the heart shape itself stand out a little better. But I also love that solid heart. And for fun, I had some leftover self-striping yarn. I thought, oh, that might look really neat to have sort of self-striping yarn as the solid color. And I do. I like the way that looks. So that's why I did 3 different, I want to show you guys sort of what you can do with the one graph. And I also kind of like to see it for myself. So if you're carrying more than one color, keep an eye on that. You're going to have 2 more yarns that you've got to tighten up on so they don't bulge out of your stitches. Some of those stitches might be thicker. You've got an extra set of spools or an extra ball of yarn that you have to try and be aware of not tangling. That's basically it. You're just compounding the work you already have to do when you're carrying a color. You're just multiplying it. So it's like scaling up. So it's not like it's any more difficult unless you consider, balancing 2 spools as opposed to 1 more difficult, or carrying more than 1 color more difficult. It's just, you're just adding to the number of things that you've got to remember. It looks cool, I think. I think that's like, it ends up being kind of neat. So that's how you would carry more than 1 color. How do you keep yarns from tangling? Asks Kathy. I like the spools. I particularly like my spools that I made because I notched the top and the bottom of the cardboard so I can just pull the yarn through it so that it won't unravel. If you've got kind of little tiny round up balls bouncing along, they're going to want to tangle. And if you don't tack up the yarn that you've got on the spool right up as close to the blanket as possible, they're going to want to dance and dangle and tangle with their neighbors. So that's how I keep the yarn from tangling. I use it, roll it back up, pinch the yarn back in the little notch at the top of the spool, and then it just hangs as close to the blanket as possible. And I have not had any tangling issues yet. So that's one problem I solved. before I started the blanket. So I really recommend the spool and the little notch at the top and using it before you're like you finish with that color, great. But before you take off and head to the next repeat of the graph, roll up the excess of that yarn color, the color B, and notch the yarn length in that spool to keep it from dangling and knocking into the other ones. Anything you'd like to add, Mr. InStitches? I'm not used to you being this quiet. I feel like I'm talking to myself.
Well, I'll come around the corner.
Sure.
Everyone's joining in the conversation. Everyone's talking about their blanket and their different styles and different colors, and
we hear lots of
how
people
they organize their yarn. A lot of people have mentioned that they love your blouse.
Oh, thank you.
They said like you look like a super teacher. Uber, you got the Uber teacher thing going today.
Just need the high bun.
Yeah, the high bun. Yeah. No, that's it. We're getting some super chats.
Thank you, everyone.
Big thank you to everyone. We're getting some super chats. We're getting some super stickers. We've got lots of members and subscribers in there.
Like I said,
and also membership milestones are coming. I'm doing my best to kind of shout everyone out on the screen. And yeah, I guess that's it. There's been the odd question, but I'm just gonna let Jayda go through the list.
Yeah, probably we'll get to it.
Yeah, and we'll probably get to it, and then if we don't, we'll just answer everyone in the comments later.
Yeah,
but we'll see.
Yeah, no problem.
Yeah, so I think that's about it from my end.
I want to thank everybody who is putting out a membership milestone or a super chat or a super sticker. We really appreciate it. Because of the setup, Mr. InStitches is not sort of chiming in with it like he normally does, because it would be a lot of him either getting up and coming into this room or yelling from the other room. So like I said, this is sort of our in-between setup. We're kind of still getting a nice technical setup so that we can do this and be in the same room again, because we like to be in the same room with each other. So things are a bit funny right now. So bear with us as we're getting through it. It's better to have where we're happy that we've got the better internet. We just now have to sort out the tech issues, and we are working on that. So thank you everybody for bearing with us. Okay, we have another question from Georgie. Georgie asked, bobble stitches. Like, how do you do bobble stitches in a graph? Which leads me to, there are a whole bunch of different graph types out there. There are different ways to read them, and we're going to talk a little bit about that later on. And there are different ways that images can be used in a graph. So I haven't done any. I know what bobble graphs look like. I haven't myself made any. I haven't bothered to make any bobble graph stuff yet. So I don't really want to comment too much on other people's bobble graphs, but I will say this. If the graph you're using is not mirror image, like the graphs we're using this year, then you have to pay extra attention to what row you're on and what side you have to start on. So if you're looking at a graph that isn't mirror image, like say a letter of the alphabet, then you need to know that there's a right side and a wrong side to your blanket. If you're right-handed, hopefully that graph will say, this is a right-handed graph, or it'll tell you where to begin. And if it's, and if it's got directions for left-handed, it'll remind a left-handed individual that they're starting on the opposite side. So that's only if left-handed, you're working left-handed. So I know a lot of people are left-handed, but crochet right-handed, meaning they're crocheting from right to left, even though they're left-handed. And I've seen some people do that, and it just boggles my mind, because it's like crocheting backwards, basically. So I'm so impressed when people can figure out how to do that. But if you're crocheting left-handed, so you're left-handed and you're working left to right, then usually you would read a graph just starting on the opposite side from the right-handed people. And that's the only difference. And then knowing that your right side is the other side. So it's just like, you're still going to get the same image, but your right side, if the right-handed version of the graph is what you see is the right side, then the left-handed has to know that what I'm looking at is the wrong side, and that my right side will just be on the other side. It'll still get the You'll still get the same effect. It's just that you're kind of doing it in reverse. So there's different ways to read a graph depending on what the graph is. There's a lot more sort of technical specifications for some graphs, which is another reason we wanted to go with the double crochet 2-to-1 ratio graph this year with the mirror imagery, because then there's just less chance of you screwing up the picture. If it's a mirror image thing and you accidentally read row 6 from the wrong side, it doesn't matter because it's the same whether you're coming in from this direction or that direction. But because we know that a lot of people have requested graph work over the years, which is why we decided that this year would be a graph-based blanket, we know that if we have a nice library of graph reading in a particular way, then once we graduate to reading graphs in a different way, it won't be quite as jarring, and we'll be able to kind of say, oh, well, now that you've all sort of been able to do this along with us, we're going to add this one new thing that you've got to keep in mind, because now we're not dealing with a mirror image picture or whatever it is. So we like to say how to read the graph just so that you kind of get into the habit, even for myself. I'm reading it this way and now I'm reading it that way, because down the road, if you're working on graphs that aren't mirror images, it will matter that you start and follow the graph the way you're supposed to. Otherwise, you're going to end up with things not working out. The image won't be right. It'll be reversed. You'll have some stuff on the right side and some stuff on the wrong side. So there's a lot of different graphs out there, and there's a lot of different ways to read them, which is why I always say, if you've got a pattern, read the entire pattern from start to finish before you start. Read the notes section, read the stitch legend, read, any funny little things in asterisks, read it all, because everybody writes a bit differently. It's like reading a book. All authors write a little bit differently. So it's good to read through a pattern. I would read through a recipe before I started it. Read the whole recipe from start to finish before you actually start into it, because you never know when someone might stick something in at the end of the pattern or the recipe that makes you go, well, if I hadn't known that up here, I would have, done it differently. Or, oh, well, now you tell me, that kind of thing. So read the whole thing before you start. And that goes for cooking too. All right, that was the last of my coffee. Mr. Stitches, I would love a glass of water if you wouldn't mind getting me one.
How am I going to get out of this well?
Well, you shouldn't have any trouble finding
I'll climb out of the well to get to coffee, but then I'm going back in the well.
Just water. Just water is fine. You can bring the water with you out of the well if you want.
I asked everyone if they'd throw down some coffee and chocolate. That way I can survive down here. Wow, nice. It's really nice and bright up here. There's daylight. It's warm. It's dry.
It's dry.
Yeah. It doesn't smell like mold and, old water. Moss and mold. Gee, you got a real nice setup up here. I think we should trade places. You want more coffee?
No, just water.
Oh, I thought you wanted me to brew more coffee.
No, you can.
So I have to live in a well, and then I have to come out just to brew you or get you water, and I have to go back to my well? Okay. Yeah. No, I think I understand the system now. Yeah, I get it. No, I get it. I understand.
Such a good sport. Okay, Maureen says, how do you keep your yarn on the spools? Great question. So in the first video, the January snowflake video, you might have seen a couple of my, oh, thank you so much. A couple of my spools kind of had some loops of yarn fall off of them, and I had to rewind them. That is because I didn't wind them tightly enough. This is another reason I recommend using cardboard. So if you're using, I think they call it paperboard, or kind of like the cereal box, which is not really cardboard. It's kind of like cardstock. It's somewhere between cardstock and cardboard. It's not really firm. I like to use two pieces together. If you're using actual cardboard, like, you cut up an Amazon box or something, nice corrugated cardboard, then you don't need to have two pieces together. But you want a little bit of strength to it, because you want to wrap your yarn somewhat tightly around it. And if you keep it sort of in the middle, going back and forth evenly with a decent amount of like tension, because it's not going to be on that spool for very long, so you don't have to worry about your yarn stretching out. But if you keep that a bit of tension and you wind it evenly in the middle of the spool, outside of the two kind of dog bone ends, try to keep most of it in the middle, then you shouldn't have a problem with it unwinding. So I made a point to wind my February spools a little tighter, evenly moving it back and forth as I wound, and I didn't have any problems with it unwinding on me. So keep the yarn evenly spaced in the middle, keep it a little bit tight, and you shouldn't have any problem with them wanting to slop off the ends. Also, we're not using too much color, so you shouldn't have too much yarn requirement for the spools. However, if it's still kind of a problem, then you might want to make yourself a set of spools that just have a slightly larger, I don't know what to call that, like this, the dog bone area and the spool part, the funnelish part, the part that sticks out. How many ways can I say that? Not the middle, but the two bottoms. You might want to make them a little bit bigger, fan out a little bit more, just so there's a little bit more of an arm on either side, keeping your yarn under control. You know, because the ones that we did might be a little too narrow for your needs, or the yarn you're using. It just depends on a lot of things. It depends on how much yarn you're using, depends on the size of the yarn, depends on how tightly you wind them, and maybe how small you made those little flanges. Can I use that word? Flanges? Yeah, so you might want to make a set that are just a little bit bigger, and that would probably help too. All right, Jilly asked, how do you know how much wool you will need? So that's kind of an open-ended question. I don't know whether she was referring to the entire blanket project, to the individual spools, to the individual section, but I thought I have some answers that will kind of answer all of those questions. Everything is always a guesstimate. Any pattern you ever pick up for knitting or crochet, and it tells you how much yarn you need, it's always kind of a really educated guess. It's probably based on the original designer's own usage, plus a few extra yards of padding. Typically, you always want to err on the side of a little bit more, because it's annoying to have a little bit less. But because our tension differs, our yarn weights differ, even our hook sizes will differ, even in the same hook size, they'll differ a little bit. Because of that, we'll all end up using different amounts of yarn. So even if, you know, you sit 5 people down with the exact same crochet hook and the exact same yarn and have them crochet 20 double crochets, they'll all use slightly different amounts of yarn. And that comes down to tension. So when I say, oh, you want around 11 yards of yarn on each spool, it's because I've done the guesstimates based on how much yarn I use. And here's my rule of thumb. If I'm using a size 4 medium weight acrylic yarn, acrylic isn't very stretchy, so that's something to keep in mind. Stretchier yarn will go a little further. So if I'm using a size 4 medium weight acrylic yarn, the very yarn that I'm using to design the whole blanket, I know that I can get roughly 8 double crochets using a 5.5 millimeter hook, or an I9, that size. So the hook that I'm using for the project, I'll get 8 double crochets to the yard. And I have done a lot of different projects now, including granny squares, hexagons, this particular blanket, last year's blanket, the blanket before. I have done a lot of projects using the double crochet stitch, size 4 medium weight acrylic yarn, the 5.5 millimeter hook, and my tension is pretty even throughout these projects, and I get roughly 8 double crochet to the yard. So that is how I figure out how much yarn we need per color, for a section, for a motif repeat, for an entire blanket. I'm doing the math calculations based on literally how many stitches there are in an area, in a pattern, in a project. And I'm also factoring in this blanket's case, carry. So if you are working a single blanket, let's say the first row of the blanket, the first row is always your A. So that will be, say, 20 double crochets of one color. There's no color carrying there. That's just plain old double crochet. But I have a foundation chain that I need to keep, remember, or I need to remind myself of. But you don't use a foundation chain every single row. So you kind of allow for so many yards for the foundation chain, and then you forget about it. Then, like if you've got 20, well, 8 goes into 20 twice, and then half again. So that would be roughly 2.5 yards for 20 stitches in that first repeat. So I know that, okay, so that one repeat, 20 stitches of the one color will be 2.5 yards, but there's a foundation chain. So I'm going to say 4 yards just to be safe for that row, because it includes a foundation chain And I've overestimated a little bit, knowing that some people have looser tension than me or bigger yarn than me or whatever the case. So that's kind of how I do the math. And again, it's based on how much yarn I'm using, the yarn I'm using, and the hook I'm using. So that's why you'll always sort of see, if you're in our Etsy shop and you read the descriptions of our patterns, we always say using the hook and yarn suggested, because it's important to indicate that if you're using the hook and yarn that we specify in the pattern, for example, this year's blanket, size 4 medium weight acrylic yarn and a 5.5 millimeter hook, because that's the yarn and the hook size that I'm using, that's the tension I get, that's the amount of yardage I assume I need. But we always say err on a little extra, just to be safe. You know, it's rare that I find people who have a tighter tension than me. I think I have even tension, but I think my tension might be just a little bit tighter than the average person. So if you're new to crochet, or you crochet quickly, or you get excited, or you know, if you are more likely to kind of crochet looser on the average than you are tighter on the average. So you're more likely to use a little extra. And I always say that. And if you don't, great, you know, you've got some extra yarn for another project. But I always err on the side of a little extra, just in case, because I don't want people to be like, oh, 11 yards. I will measure out exactly 11 yards and then wind up being half a yard short every single time and go, why? It's because maybe your yarn is a different weight than mine. Maybe it's a little less stretchy than the acrylic I'm using. Like maybe there's a stretch to my yarn that yours definitely does not have. Maybe your stitches are bigger. Maybe your hook is slightly different. Maybe the way you crochet gives you bigger stitches, like your tension is looser or something. So I try to think of all those things when I come up with an estimated amount of yardage for a color or a motif or an entire project. So if you're kind of experimenting on your own and you're making a sampler, this is another good time for you to go, okay, I'm going to make the sampler. Let's see, I'm going to do exactly what Jayda said. I'm going to put up one spool. I'm going to put 11 yards on it. I'm going to work away at it. How did I do? Did I use up the 11 yards? Did I need more? Did I need less? How does my tension look? Doing this sampler will give you a really good idea how to do that entire strip of the blanket. So if you realize, you know what, I do exactly 11 yards and I always end up with a yard more, then you may only need 10 yards per spool. If you do 11 yards, do the sampler, and you're short, you're probably going to want to do 12 yards per spool. That's why I always say, do the sampler. The sampler tells you a lot about yourself, and it doesn't just get you comfortable with the project. Plus, you know, you might be like, gee, I really prefer those colors, or yeah, you know, I think I think the heart looks more defined if I do the whole solid thing. Like whatever, it depends on the colors you're using, you know. That's why these are fun. And I am definitely going to be turning all of my samplers. I've got my snowflake sampler. I'm going to be turning all of my samplers into some kind of project at the end of the year. I was originally thinking like a scarf or maybe a small blanket, but as you'll see throughout the year, I kind of am going nuts with the samplers. Ooh, I like that color combination. Oh, I might want to try, you know, this change as opposed to that change. Plus, I know that a lot of you, you know, once you get comfortable, Cinnamon, Jennifer says she's going to be alternating between like solid heart and open heart all the way across. Love that idea. Some of you were asking, if I do the solid heart, for example, how much more yarn should I put on the spool? Great question. And I think in that I was answering, add an additional 6 to 8 yards to the 11. So if I said, yeah, you know, use 11 to 12 and you want to do a full heart, you might want to do like 14 to 16, maybe 15 yards, because you also don't have any carry. If you're doing the solid double crochet heart, like the solid heart like this one, you're not carrying the bee color really anywhere except just a couple rows up at the top. So you have less carry, but you have more double crochet. So again, do a sampler, figure out how much you need, and that will give you a really good educated guess of how much you need per spool if you're making little alterations to the project, like the solid heart as opposed to the open heart. I cannot stress the handiness of these little things enough. And you know what? if you just want to do a little sampler and not the whole blanket project because you've got a million other things on the go, but you want to experiment with graph work, then I've been telling everybody that, again, you can end up using all of these in another project, sort of stitch them all together again, have like a cute little blanket or a little wall hanging or something. But if you're using cotton yarn, you've got a really cute dishcloth, just poof, like that. And I think Steve made one and he put the single crochet border all the way around the edge. Like he just finished off the sampler with a single crochet edging, and voila, you've got like a perfectly useful motif and or dishcloth if you use cotton. So I love these things. Super handy. I'm gonna sip some of my water now.
Well, water.
It's very good. It's nice and cold.
Yeah, it's cold down here.
All right. Here's a general question. So we saw this coming up a lot from a lot of different people. A lot of you have said you want to work the blanket in reverse. So just to kind of illustrate what I'm talking about, I am doing this year's blanket. So January is going to be at the bottom and every successive month will be going on top. So January starts at the bottom, then February, March, so on and so on. A lot of you were like, well, I kind of like January to be at the top and to work my way down. Absolutely no problem. Because January looks the same whether it's upside down or right side up, you would then work the February graph and all other graphs. So you're still working onto the top of the blanket, but what you're doing is you're working the graph from the top to the bottom. So you're reading 11, 10, 9, 8, 7. You're reading the rows in reverse as opposed to the rows going from the bottom to the top. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It will not change the outcome of the blanket. It'll just be in reverse. So you'll end up with January, February, March, April, May, as opposed to January, February, March, April, May, the way I'm doing it. And if you like, you can do one going in both directions. You could go January to December, top to bottom, or bottom to top, and then another one, top to bottom if you wanted. So all you have to do to reverse it is add every month. You're still working the same direction. Like it's not like you're trying to work below it. You're still building on top of the next month's rows. You're just working the graph. You're reading it from top to bottom, and that will have the pattern print out like a printer. Think of yourself as a printer. The dot matrix printer will print out in reverse, so that eventually when you hold up your blanket, January will be at the top. Everything will be right side up. It'll just be all going in descending order as opposed to ascending order. So no, it will not change the outcome of the blanket. And absolutely, yes, you can do that. You can read it from top to bottom as opposed to bottom to top. And I think that's really a great thing to point out because I guess it kind of comes down to a bit of perspective. Like I see January as the first month of the year. And so it's down here. And then it's like layers of sand. As the months pass in a year, they all kind of land on top of each other, pushing the other month down. That's in my brain, that's how it goes. So I saw January, February, and then all the way you get to the end, and December is the last month of the year, and that's the one on top. Mr. InStitches sees it in reverse to that. He was like, he sees January's first, so it's always up at the top. And a lot of you say you see it that way too. Like, no, January's first, so it's at the top. And then February, and then March. And then December is the last one. It's number 12. It's at the bottom. And I thought, of course, it just depends, I guess, on how you maybe sort of see a year passing in your mind. So I thought that was kind of neat. Anyway, yeah, a lot of people asked about doing it in reverse. So we wanted to make sure we mentioned that today because it's a great idea and it absolutely works. And once again, when we make a calendar blanket, we always say to you, it's your blanket. You can sort of fiddle with it as much as you want. So if you're going to be working in reverse, please remember that you can pop into our Etsy shop and share photos with us. You don't even need an account. You just click on our Etsy shop link, go to message seller, and inside the little message box in the top right-hand corner, there's this cute little, looks almost like a simplified landscape painting. You just click on that and it'll allow you to upload a photograph, whether you're on a PC or a tablet or a phone, doesn't matter. And I would love to see what you're coming up with. A lot of you have already been sharing photos of your blanket there with us. Thank you, because I love to see it. I love to see everybody's color combinations. I love to see, just sort of the differences people have, the different things people have tried out with the actual graph itself. And then, of course, now seeing it in reverse, love it. So yes, that's possible. And please, please keep the pictures coming because I'm really enjoying looking at them. Okay. Another question we had. What happens if your spool runs out of yarn? So this was, I think I covered this already, and I'm going to mention it again because we did a quick tip video on it because a lot of people asked. And I'm just tying in yarn, nothing fancy. If you have a tie-in method that you prefer, you can of course use it, but that's all you're doing. You're just tying in a little extra yarn to the spool and you're guesstimating how much you need. So for example, I know that I get 8 double crochet to the yard pretty much consistently. So if I was short 4 double crochet to finish off a graph thing, I would want to go, well, that would be about half a yard. Plus, I'm going to want some left over for tail because I want to weave in a tail to keep everything from unraveling. So I would say, well, 4 double crochet, I get 8 to the yard. So half of that would be half a yard plus a little extra for a tail. So I would tie in a little over half a yard. Works like a charm. So that's another good reason to do a sampler because then you know how much yarn to the yard you get, how many stitches to the yard. And if you run out of yarn, you have a better way of estimating how much yarn you need to tie in and not like tying in too much and wasting it or tying in too little and having to tie in all over again. And typically, if you run out, it'll probably be just with a few stitches to go. So you shouldn't ever need to tie in more than like half a yard. I think that's largely it. The last thing I wanted to talk about today was just general help in reading graphs. And we touched on it a little bit, but graph reading is really cool. And it really opens up the world of crochet possibility. And there are a lot of different ways you can use a graph. So many years ago here on the channel, we did a graph GAN. We did a Mario blanket graph GAN. And I don't have it handy. I still have it, but I don't have it handy. Otherwise, I'd pull it out and kind of show it to you. But basically, you are using a graph. It's a 1-to-1 row to stitch ratio. I'll explain more about that in a second, but it's a 1-to-1. So for every stitch, if you think of graph paper from high school, they're perfectly square little boxes. That's a 1-to-1 row stitch ratio. So the row height is the same as the stitch width, right? That's 1-to-1. You can use a 1-to-1 graph ratio image to make corner to corner blankets, but you're reading the graph on that funny angle, which works, but my gosh, do you have to pay attention because and I find it if you are doing corner to corner graph work, it helps to have a pen or a marker to literally check off, like highlight the angled row of boxes that you're paying attention to, just so you don't confuse it with other rows on either side. Those have such cool effects and they really look pixelated, but I feel like you have to pay really close attention to what you're doing, which is fine. But we didn't start with a corner to corner graph style blanket or video because I don't know how to do a good tutorial on a corner to corner graph without it being like a 2-hour video. And these ones for the Fair Isle style blanket are already like hitting the hour mark because we want to be as thorough as possible, reading the graph and also giving you the stitch counts of the individual colors. So I'm still not sure how we would do a nice tutorial on a corner to corner graph without it being like 2 hours long. So maybe we'll do like a live on that at some point because they really are cool. I love people's corner to corner graph blankets. They're just amazing. You know, because of the concept of the corner to corner stitch, you can continue to add to a blanket. You can go out the side, if you can go at the bottom if you have to. So it's really kind of, you can get real crazy with those graphs, and some of the things that people have made are absolutely amazing. So using 1-to-1 ratio works for corner to corner graph work. It also works for squares. So the graph GAN we made with Mario was little single crocheted squares. You can also alternatively use granny squares like and it'll have that pixelated look like our temperature blanket does from 2016. And again, it would be a 1-to-1 ratio. So the height of the row is equal to the width of the stitch. Row, stitch, 1-to-1. That's your plain graph paper kind of concept. If you're using a graph to go back and forth, like we are for this year's blanket, and you're using the single crochet stitch, a 1-to-1 ratio, again, that high school graph paper, is the method to go with for single crochet. Because single crochet is a short stitch. It's about as high as it is wide, typically. And I find my single crochets are exactly as high as they are wide if I'm using a size 4 medium weight acrylic yarn and a 5.5 millimeter hook. Once again, if you're going to experiment with graphs, you get the hook you want to use for the project, you get the yarn you want to use for the project, and you work on a little sampler. Maybe there's a gauge. You try that out so that in case your single crochets are really tight, so they're really small, but they're quite wide, well, then you might have to adjust your graph to be a 2-to-1 ratio. We're using a 2-to-1 ratio because we're using the double crochet stitch. So the 2-to-1 ratio means that the row is double the height of the width of the stitch. So for every stitch, the bottom of that double crochet is half the measurement of its height. So the width is half of the height measurement. So 2-to-1 ratio. This works really well for double crochet. I like using the double crochet stitch because I find it's easy. I like being a little bit removed from the body of my work with my stitch work because it allows me to kind of see what I'm doing. It allows me to see where I'm carrying the yarn. Single crochet would work for our overall blanket project this year, but in your brain, you have to remember that you are repeating every row twice with single crochet. So you do it once going this way, you do the exact same thing going that way before you go to the next row. This way and then that way. So you go backwards and forwards for every single row of the actual pattern. So if it's 11 rows in our pattern, like this little guy is 11 rows, then it would be 22 rows of single crochet. So backwards, this way, all one color. This way change 2, this way change 2. This way changes, that way changes. So you're doing every row twice, exactly the same way, coming and going. If you're going to treat it like a 1-to-1 ratio, so and use single crochet. So you'd have to basically do a little bit of math. Make sure that you don't miss a row if you're using single crochet, because otherwise it'll throw the whole look off, but you can do that. And that way, if you're using single crochet, for example, some people like the single crochet 1-to-1 ratio graph work because you're less likely to see some carried color, although I feel like you still see carried color. The thing I don't like as much about the single crochet graph work and color changing is that there's more, I feel with the single crochet, you see a lot more color changing notches along the outside of your work. That's my opinion. It also might have something to do with the way I do my color changes. But I feel like there's a lot less of that change of color notch work. So like just where you see like, the yarn was being picked up to be changed here or dropped and tucked away over there. There's a lot less of that in the double crochet 2-to-1 ratio graph than there is in the single crochet graph. And believe me when I tell you that a lot of research and sampling goes into making these counter blankets. We try to go with the easiest and most attractive look when we're settling on something. There's also the half double crochet stitch. I don't want to leave this entirely without saying, because of people's yarn choices, hook choices, and stitch tension, the half double crochet stitch is an excellent thing to try if you're doing samplers and you just can't quite get the look of something that you want. So maybe your double crochets are too tall and you feel like they look taller than they are wide. And maybe your single crochets are too short. Try to experiment with the half double crochet too. Half double crochet might be useful for you coming and going if you're using a really thin weight yarn like a DK or lighter. And because in that case, a half double crochet will function as thickly height-wise as a single crochet would with a thicker yarn or a bigger hook. Likewise, if you feel like your double crochets are too tall, because let's say you're using a really big hook and a really thick yarn, then you might want to go with a half double crochet stitch, which will just shorten it enough that it looks right for that 2-to-1 ratio. So don't forget the half stitches if you're experimenting, if you're, trying to get the feel of a particular look, or you're just cruising around the internet and you found a really cute little like perler bead graph that's like for something small, or a cross stitch graph that you really like. These are all, intermixable. Perler bead, cross stitch, some basic, embroidery stuff. It's all kind of based on a square grid pattern. So you can kind of like pull some things sideways if you're just sort of fiddling around. Like if you've got like an old book of cross stitch imagery for like really simple, small little cross stitches, pull them out. Try to turn them into a single crochet or a half double crochet, graph or something, because you might be delighted by the results. You also might go, yeah, no, that doesn't work, but this one over here does. So don't forget the half stitches when you're experimenting with samplers, because it depends on the yarn, the hook, and your own personal tension a lot. And if you're just trying to sort of put something together, like you want to make just a little something like a mug rug or a cute little, anything, don't forget the half stitches. So don't sit down and go, oh, this is a double crochet 2-to-1 ratio thing, therefore I must use the double crochet in order to get this look. If it doesn't look right, isn't necessarily something that you're doing or you don't get. So don't beat yourself up. Just try a different stitch. You know what? This just looks tall to me. Well, try the half double crochet stitch instead of the double crochet stitch. You might be like, yeah, that looks better. Or, this single crochet stitch is just too small. It's too squat. It doesn't, it ends up, the whole image looks squished. Substitute in the half double crochet stitch. Play with the stitches. That's why they're there. And different projects call for different tweaks. Again, can't underscore the importance of the sampler enough. And just a last little comment on left versus right. So if you're reading graphs and you're left-handed, it's good to know if you're left-handed and you work left-handed versus being right-handed and working right-handed. So I'm right-handed and I work right-handed crochet. I work from right to left. If you're left-handed and you work left-handed crochet, you are working from left to right. So like you would read, Western text, left to right. If you're left-handed, but you were taught to work right-handed, so you might still be handling the hook in your left hand, but you're working right-handed, meaning you work from right to left. Remember that if you're reading a pattern and it's assuming that most patterns, I think the industry standard is assume right-handedness. I think that's kind of typical for a lot of things. They just sort of assume right-handedness. But if you're a lefty, but you work right-handed, then you treat that graph. If the graph says, hey, lefties start here, but you work right-handed and you're comfortable working right-handed, then you would act as a right-handed person and read it from the right-handed angle. I don't know too many right-handed people who were taught by lefties and therefore work left-handed with a right hand. But if you are that person, you're right-handed, but you work left, then remember, if the graph says, oh, for lefties start over here, remember that you are right-handed, but you work left-handed, so you would follow the left-handed directions for a graph. Otherwise, if you're left, you work left, follow the lefty directions. If you're right, you work right, assume the right-handed is the sort of the base concept of the graph. That's why all this year, we're going to just kind of keep reminding you, right-handed, you're over here, left-handed, you're over there. But ultimately, it doesn't matter for our graphs, for our blanket pattern project this year, whether you go read from one direction or the other, because we're doing mirror image graphs, because we were trying to alleviate the problem of, oh my gosh, I forgot which side I was on, and, I did, these first stitches, and then I didn't do them, and now the whole thing looks wrong. We wanted to alleviate that. So no matter what direction you read our graph from this year for any of the months in this calendar blanket project, you're always going to get the right look, so long as you're on the right row. So it doesn't matter if you're reading it right-handed or left-handed. It's always going to turn out exactly the same, because it's the same whether you're coming or going. And we did that on purpose because we were trying to make it as accessible for the people who haven't done one before. We did a quick poll of the family members before we went live today and asked, hey, is this, you've got previous experience with graph work? Is this your first time? Maybe you have no experience and you're still kind of nervous. And it was quite illuminating to realize that a lot of people have not done any graph work, and this is the first graph work that they're doing. So I'm touched and delighted that you've trusted your graph learning technique with us. And that's another reason we're trying to make it as simple and as accessible as possible. So if you're still on the fence about, I don't know if I want to invest in the whole blanket, it still makes me nervous. I'm not sure I want to deal with all those dangling, tangling possible spools and whatnot, then I highly recommend just making the little samplers this year, fiddling with the graph yourself, getting comfortable with it, getting comfortable with changing colors. but only dealing with one spool, or if you're, you know, just going to grab another ball of yarn, just dealing with making sure you're not tangling 2 balls of yarn. It's great practice. You can always use a little motif. These little guys are going to operate like miniature granny squares. They're all going to be about 6.5 inches by 6.5 inches if you use the hook and yarn that I'm using. If you're using DK weight, which is about a 3, and maybe you're using like a 5mm hook, they'll be a little smaller, like 6 by 6. But they're going to act like granny squares. So at some point you could put a border on them if you want and turn them all into another blanket, or you could just sort of stitch them together as is into like a scarf or something, you know. Little tiny sampler motifs don't go to waste. And if you're the kind of person who's like, well, I'm going to do them all, but I'm going to do them all in the same 2 colors. Well, you've just inadvertently made yourself the beginnings of a really cool blanket. Like mine, as usual, this is my personality. Like, oh, these 2 colors, oh, these completely 2 different. Oh, here's 3 colors that don't make any sense together. Like, that's me. Not only am I using up my scraps, but I also like experimenting with different shades. And ultimately, this is going to look like one of those boho scrap granny square blankets from like the 60s or the 70s. I'm kind of have that in the back of my head. If I make a blanket, I don't know. At this point, the pile of samplers are piling up. So it might be something else. I'm not sure. Also, I want to take the opportunity to just show you this. So if you didn't see our last post, we posted on Saturday. It was a little later in the day, I think, or maybe it was sometime on Saturday. So not everybody's kind of got an eyeball on YouTube on Saturday. So if you didn't see our post, we've had a lot of requests over the years to do awareness ribbon crochet projects. And Cheryl popped into our shop and mentioned it in relation to this year's blanket last week. And I realized that, you know, this is a great opportunity to do an awareness ribbon motif based on the same concept as this year's blanket graph. So big thank you to Cheryl and everybody else who has requested an awareness ribbon crochet pattern over the years. We've always kind of been trying to think of like a kind of a neat way to make one that you could substitute in the color you need for the cause you want to make it for. So this is the same concept graph as the rest of them in this year's blanket. This is not part of this year's blanket, but if you wanted to add it in, you are more than welcome to. So you would just use it the same way the other patterns are being used. It's the same 11 row by 20 stitch 2-to-1 ratio concept. It's the first and last row is just the solid A color, and then you would just look at the graph and count the stitches before you change color, or just, we've also written it out. So it's a freebie over on our website. I'm not sure if I said that yet, but it's over on our website on the pattern workshop page. We'll make sure that link is available in various locations. It'll be on the pattern workshop page. It's free. It's got the graph, just like you see in the corner of our videos. It's also got the pattern written out for how many stitches of A, B, etc. Now, we don't include the repeats because I don't know how many you would want to do in a project that you'd be using it for. The idea of this free pattern is so that you can repeat it as many times as you want, or make them individual squares like this one. You can use it exactly how we're using the other graphs of the same concept in this year's blanket. So if you wanted to add in a row of awareness ribbon to your blanket this year, go right ahead. It will also be an additional 6.5 inches of height to the blanket, which is totally cool. You could use this, you could use the awareness ribbon graph in lieu of one of the other graphs we're doing this year. If like we come up on one and you're like, well, yeah, you know, I think I'd rather do the awareness ribbon or something, you can totally substitute that in. You can add it in. You can use it however you want. We know a lot of people have been really looking for the opportunity to make things that have the awareness ribbon in it for whatever their reason is. Like I said, you know, you can do scarves, you could do bags, you could do blankets. It's a motif and it's square. And that's a free pattern for everybody to make use of over on our website. You can just find the thumbnail. It'll be this picture, and then the PDF pattern link will be underneath it. You just click on that link and it'll download to your tablet, phone, computer, whatever. All of the things that we put up on our website, all of the links that say PDF that sit underneath one of our photographs, it'll have the name of the actual pattern file, and those are ours. We host them, so you don't have to worry about them being weird. Our PDF links that sit under the thumbnails that actually have the name of the pattern on it, those are ours. We created them. We put them up on our website. We're managing that website. So don't worry about downloading it. It's just a typical PDF pattern. It's exactly like the pattern style concept of file that you would pick up at our Etsy shop. So there you go. That's there for everybody to use. You can use it in the blanket this year if you want, or you can use it anywhere else you might want it. So yeah, I was kind of happy that that came up and that we were able to put that out there for everybody. I'm going to ask Mr. InStitches if there's anything he'd like to mention, or if he saw anything kind of come up that he wanted to remind me of, or kind of just ask. Otherwise, if you have any questions that we didn't answer today, please leave them in the comment section down below. If we see enough of something coming up, we'll maybe do another quick tip video for everybody, because I like that we're getting a little library of quick tip videos that surround this project in general. We're also adding them all to the playlist. And the playlist for the 2023 Fair Isle style calendar blanket will also always include all the little tip videos. So if you stumble across one of the Fair Isle style related tutorials, in the description box, the playlist will be there. So if you're trying to find the other matching tutorials or videos in the series, they're all going to be connected to that same playlist. So that's an easy way to find everything if you're trying to find it, or you're trying to back up a month or something. Because I know a lot of you like to kind of go through the whole year, watch how it's coming together, and then sit down and do it either the following year, or maybe it's your Christmas present to yourself. You kind of put your feet up and you make the calendar blanket. I do that too. I see the odd little annual crochet along, and I watch the whole thing come together, and then I sit down and go, yeah, you know what, I think I'll do that too. And I might work on it or use aspects of it for, at the end of the year, just sort of as a little gift to myself. So yeah, there's a lot of different ways to work on this year's blanket along with us. You can just make the samplers. You can do it the whole blanket. You can sort of sit back and watch and then do it all later if you want. It's entirely up to you. It's so fun to have a crochet along project to do with you all. And we love this style. I love the first Friday of the month, knowing that it's coming, knowing that it's a surprise. I love that you guys are trying to guess the next images. I think you're going to start having trouble as the months continue, because as we like to do, we are going to slowly, try to stretch your brain and stretch your fingers a little bit with this project. I guarantee you're going to like it. So remember that you can always repeat another image. You could do an entire blanket of just the hearts, or just the snowflakes, or just the awareness ribbon. You know what I mean? Like you could, and because we're doing the same graph concept for every single month, you might want to experiment by doing, I don't know, an alternating between a snowflake and a heart for some kind of project down the road, because they're the same graph concept. So 11 rows by 20 stitches. So I don't know, you can get creative. I love to do that. That's one of my favorite things to do every year with these calendar blanket projects. I always end up making 2 or 3 of them, because I'm experimenting with colors and stuff as we go. And I realize I don't always show you guys the other thing. And in fact, there's a few, I remember I said, I don't know, in a live stream like several months ago now, I have another bin of blanket squares, and I knew I had it lying around. When we moved the craft room, I stumbled across it. I was like, aha, here it is. Well, now I'm not sure where that bin went again, because there's a whole pile. I have enough 12-inch fancy blanket squares from Patchwork, the fancy calendar blanket from 2017, other blanket squares that we've done for the Etsy shop for special patterns that all fit with the 12-inch fancy granny squares. I have a bin full of them that I haven't even put into a blanket yet. I have another half a blanket done that needs a border. I have a lot, and I haven't even shown those guys to you because I keep forgetting where I put the bin. So when I come across that bin again, we'll do a live stream where I just show you some more of these blanket squares we've done, because should really get them out and turn them into a blanket. They're just sort of hiding in a bin right now. Anyway, Mr. InStitches, do you have anything further to add before we wrap up today's stream?
I'll just climb out of the well here. Don't worry, everyone. I'll do it on my own. Got absolutely no help.
I put a ladder down there for you.
No one threw down coffee. No one threw down chocolate.
I'll make you a coffee.
I've run out of water. The heater's in here. I'm freezing down there. Actually, there were a few questions, but to be honest, they kind of worked their way up the chat, so I don't know if I could find them. So You've already covered that. If we didn't get to a question based on the list, just leave it in the comment section, and then you can get to them.
Yes, and I will answer them directly. And if there's enough of the same concept, we'll do a little quick tip video on it.
Yeah. Otherwise, I'll be yelling down the tin can, the well made of tin cans all afternoon.
Thank you so much for bearing with us, guys. We are still working on our tech setup, so it's not going to be like this forever. We're going to go back to having the two of us in the same room somehow. We're going to figure it out.
Oh yeah.
But it's been funny not having you
sort
in
our
here.
stuff out here.
Yeah. We're still sorting.
Yeah, still sorting.
This might look put together. It's not.
It's just what you see on the screen.
Yeah, just off camera, everything's a complete disaster, including me.
We're actually outside in the field right now.
Oh, and just a quick note on my.
We're in a ditch at the side of the road.
We're in a ditch at the side of the road. Just a quick note on my shirt, as you said, a couple people were mentioning it.
Yeah, you've been. There's been a few mentions. You look like a teacher. You're part of like a vampire show / movie. A pirate. A lot of people love it. Oh, you should show your skirt.
Okay, well,
stand up and show your outfit there.
So
little buttons on the.
I made everything. I made my blouse and I made my skirt. I've got these little pockets on it here, so it sort of looks the same. This is your typical A-line skirt. I made everything. I made the blouse. There's a story behind the blouse. So before we go, let me just tell you the story behind this ridiculous blouse. I haven't had the opportunity to sew many tops, specifically tops with collars. So several years ago, I went to the fabric store and I thought, I am going to find a pattern with a collar, and I'm going to buy this shirt pattern with a collar and practice making a shirt with a collar. Well, I looked and looked and looked, and I guess it was just the time that I was looking, but the trend was collarless blouses and collarless shirts. So I couldn't find anything that had a collar, except in the historical costume section of the patterns. So this is literally a pirate shirt. It's got the extra thing and it laces up the whole 9 yards. It's got the big balloony sleeves, but it had a really nice collar, and I thought, well, that's a good thing to practice on. And in the meantime, I'll also learn how to do it, like a placket and the extra ruffles and stuff. And I bought, I also couldn't find a fabric that I really wanted to use. So this is like a seersucker, which has a lot of stretch to it. So I don't recommend using seersucker fabric that has a lot of give to it to try and make something like a fitted blouse, because there was a lot of interesting language coming out of my mouth while I was working on this. Now, having said that, I kind of like the way it turned out. It's a little bit over the top. Like, I couldn't wear this underneath like a sweater because of all this extra stuff and the blousiness of it. But I do like it. It is a little historic. It is a little kind of sort of silly over the top. But I thought, since, Fair Isle style crochet, Fair Isle style knitting was kind of the concept of the day. When I think of, like, old seafaring, folks living on an island, I tend to think of pirate shirts. So I wore this today. But yes, I did make this. It's a little over the top, but it's actually quite comfortable. And I made my skirt too. I love to sew. I know a lot of you know that, but
you also look like a prince.
I look like a prince. It is very princely. It's because of all the extra.
Maybe the 1600s.
Yeah, it's because of the extra ruffle. I love blouses that are over the top. Anyway, I like the ones that have.
Maybe Prince the singer.
Oh my gosh! Yes.
Yeah.
Rest in peace.
Yeah.
He would wear those fabulous tops with, like, in the 80s. Yeah. Oh yeah, I never even thought of that.
Down here? Can I get a survival kit?
I'll come get you in a minute.
Maybe some really hard stale bread.
Some pirate provisions. Anyway, thanks very much, guys. Yep, this is one of the weird things from my closet, but I thought it was good to wear today. We will see you Friday here on the Jayda InStitches show for our regular Friday upload. Tune in to find out what that's going to be. And of course, the next installment of the Fair Isle style calendar blanket will be the first Friday in March. A lot of people are still kind of asking, hey, like, when's the next one? When's the next one? It's always the first Friday of the month. So January is always a little bit different. We kind of take our time getting started. And then it's always the first Friday of the month for the rest of the year. Sometimes we try to squeeze December's in, depending on how the days fall and the Fridays fall leading up to Christmas, Hanukkah, the end of the year, because we know a lot of people like to give the blanket as a gift. So we try to have the whole thing kind of done in good time, so that if you're giving it away, you know, you're not waiting, especially if the first Friday isn't like until a full 7 days in, because then you're really, you know, far into the month before the first Friday shows up. So we kind of fiddle with the last installment. And this year, because we're building the blanket as we go, there's no join video. There will only be a border video. And of course, we will get the border video out in early December. It's usually the video that follows the last installment. So we try to do them bang bang, so that they're both up, the project's done, and then if you can, you know, have some time to complete it if you're giving it as a gift. So that's the schedule. First Friday of the month, except for December, might be a little bit, you know, end of November, beginning of December can be a little bit creative depending on how the calendar days fall. But the rest of the months are always the first Friday. So I'm about to lose my voice. I'm going to go have some more water. I'm going to pull Mr. InStitches out of the well.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for hanging out with us today. Thank you for the super chats and the super stickers and the milestones. I'm going to go back and read them. Because of our setup, we can't have Mr. Stitches trying to yell from the other room, and I cannot see anything. I have no screens in front of me, so I can't see anything. But I really appreciate everybody who's popped in, subscribed, helped out with some support here on the YouTube channel, or by popping into our shop and picking up a pattern. And don't forget, we've got the free one over on our website, JaydaInStitches.com, and it's the pattern workshop page. If you're going there on a tablet or a phone, when you arrive on the top on the page, up at the top, you'll see some lines. Click on those lines, and that opens up the menu for the rest of the website. And you'll see the pattern workshop page is one of them. Click on that, and then you can just scroll down. We've got a lot of free patterns there. So if you're new and you've never visited our pattern workshop page on our website, please do. There's just a ton of free stuff there. We've also got the tools page. There's a lot of really helpful tools and charts, and there's some downloadable stuff there too. So definitely give our website a perusal if you're new and you haven't. We try to update it fairly regularly as things come along, and our most recent update was Saturday. We added a free pattern. So thank you. Hope we answered most of your questions. If not, leave them in the comment section down below. We'll answer them directly. If there's enough kind of interest in a particular question, or maybe gets a bunch of thumbs up, we will create a special video for it.
Sorry. Down here.
Sorry. All right, that's it. You guys know the drill. Stay safe. Stay safe, stay crafty. We'll see you Friday, and take care. Thanks for hanging out. Bye, everybody.